136 people die every day from an opioid overdose, and each year, deaths continue to rise. So how did we get here? Well, the nation's first opioid crisis started over a century before the infamous mismarketing of OxyContin. So let's draw the connections. In both epidemics, we see pain used as a marketing tool to integrate opioids into regular medical treatment. Anesthesia is invented in 1846, changing the nation's perception of pain. And in 1996, pain as the fifth vital sign is introduced to diagnose pain subjectively. Then we see so-called non-addictive opioids emerge, heroin in 1898 and OxyContin in 1995. The medical use of these opiates are widespread, available over the counter in the early 1900s and prescribed for moderate to severe pain in the early 2000s. Thanks to concerned doctors and community organizers, and overall public awareness of the dangers of opioids reemerge, and in 1910 and 2012, prescriptions slow down, but the crisis doesn't. Heroin is outlawed by 1924, and OxyContin is reformulated in 2010, but even legislation can't stop the snowball that's already been set into motion. Users then turn to illicit drugs when prescription opioids are no longer widely available. Finally, those struggling with addiction are framed as criminals, and the stigmatization of opioid addiction is weaponized by pharmaceutical companies to protect themselves from blame. Altogether, we start to see a really dangerous pattern. Manipulation of fact plays a role in history repeating itself. But what really happens when your brain becomes addicted to opioids? In phase 1, we see the brain producing endorphins, the body's natural opioid. In phase 2, we see an opioid first taken, and the brain's reward system become flooded with euphoria. In phase 3, we start to see a dependence on opioids to feel normal. Tolerance weakens, and the brain functions more or less normally when opioids are present, and abnormally when they're not. In phase 4, your brain is altered, no longer producing natural opioids and depending entirely on the drug to regulate. Withdrawal symptoms become unbearable, known as dope sick. But with the help of MAT, or medication-assisted treatment, we can help to regulate the physiology of the brain and curb cravings and withdrawals. MAT is the medical standard of treatment for opioid dependence disorder. MAT is essential in recovery, and yet it's not accessible to most vulnerable counties. Here we see overdose deaths per 100,000 people from 2010 to 2020. And if we overlay pills per 100 people from 2012, the year when prescriptions peaked, we see that there's a ton of correlation between the vulnerable counties and pill availability, due to pills being the onset of this crisis. But if we overlay the current available MAP providers over the same overdose map, we should see a similar amount of correlation, but unfortunately do not. Treatment is very scarce in many vulnerable counties. And to make matters worse, existing providers can only treat up to about 30 patients within their state, which means that while these are all the providers previously accounted for, these are the providers that haven't yet met their patient limit. Alleviating future escalation of the modern opioid crisis requires understanding the onset of the first opioid epidemic, sympathizing with the physiology of addiction, and making medication-assisted treatment widely available.